better criminals, not better citizens. We must build prisons on a historic scale, deport foreign national offenders faster than ever, and speed up our courts. Yet still, despite all that, we must reform sentencing too. So, more in hope than expectation, despite, not because, of experience, and by appealing to the better...
The end of protests as we know them. Before we dive into what might be the most significant shift in British civil liberties in decades, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you affects every single person in this country, whether you've ever attended a protest or not. Right? Let's get into it. The government has just announced something rather extraordinary. Pro-Palestine protests, and potentially any demonstrations that make communities feel uncomfortable, could be banned outright. Not restricted. Not redirected. Banned. And if you're thinking this sounds like something from a different era of British politics, you'd be right to pause. But here we are, in 2025, watching the Home Secretary confirm plans to hand police sweeping new powers to shut down protests before they even begin. Now, the catalyst for this seismic policy shift was the Manchester synagogue attack. Tragic, horrific, and absolutely worthy of our collective condemnation. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean deeply concerning. The Home Secretary, Naz Mahmood, called on pro-Palestine protest organizers to cancel their demonstrations on Saturday following the atrocity. They didn't. The protests went ahead. And now we're looking at legislation that could fundamentally alter the relationship between the British state and its citizens' right to assembly. Let's break down what's actually being proposed, because the details matter enormously. Police chiefs will be granted the power to impose restrictions on protests based on something called cumulative impact. Think about that phrase for a moment. Cumulative impact. Not the impact of a single protest. Not evidence of violence or disorder at a specific event, but the accumulated effect of multiple demonstrations over time. The feeling they create. The sense of intimidation they allegedly generate. We've moved from policing actions to policing atmospheres. Under these new rules, if you attend a march that violates these restrictions, you could face 3 months in prison. If you organize one, that's 6 months behind bars. 6 months. For organizing a protest that the police have decided, based on this nebulous concept of cumulative impact, shouldn't go ahead. Now, I'm not naive. I understand that communities, particularly Jewish communities in this instance, have expressed genuine fear. That fear is real and it deserves to be taken seriously. But the question we should all be asking is this. Is criminalizing protest the answer, or is it a sledgehammer to crack a nut that will ultimately damage the very foundations of British democracy? The government's position is clear. They are framing this as a balance between the right to protest and the right of communities to feel safe. Ms. Mahmood has been explicit about this. She's talked about Jewish communities feeling unsafe, intimidated, and scared to leave their homes due to repeated protests. And she's right to acknowledge those concerns. But here's the thing about rights in a democratic society. They are meant to protect unpopular speech, uncomfortable demonstrations, and yes, even protests that make people feel deeply uneasy. Because the moment we start restricting rights based on how they make us feel, we're on exceptionally dangerous ground. Now, Saturday's events have been weaponized quite effectively in this debate. Nearly 500 people were arrested for supporting Palestine Action, which the government has prescribed as a terrorist organization. The Board of Deputies for British Jews called the protest an affront to public decency. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, went even further, blasting what he called a pathetically weak and cowardly elite class for failing to protect Jewish people. He warned that the Manchester attack was a logical endpoint of escalating extremism. Strong words, emotive language, and politically rather clever timing. But let's be clear-eyed about what's happening here. A terrorist attack, committed by an individual, is being used to justify sweeping restrictions on collective action. The government is essentially arguing that because some people at some protests have called for violence against Jewish people, and because Jewish communities feel intimidated by repeated demonstrations, we need to give police the power to ban entire categories of protests based on their cumulative effect. That's not a surgical response. That's carpet-bombing civil liberties. The Home Office has confirmed that Ms. Mahmood will review existing legislation to ensure it's fit for purpose, including powers to ban protests entirely, not just restrict them. not just move them to different locations or different times. Ban them. And the criteria for these bans will include considerations of how communities feel, not whether laws have been broken, not whether violence has occurred, but whether people feel intimidated. Now, feelings are important, obviously, but building a legal framework for suppressing protests based on subjective feelings rather than objective harms is a recipe for authoritarian overreach. Let's talk about precedent for a moment, because this matters. The UK has a long and proud tradition of protest. From the suffragettes to the miners' strikes, from anti-war demonstrations to climate activism, British people have always reserved the right to take to the streets when they feel their government is getting it wrong. It's messy. It's sometimes inconvenient. It occasionally crosses lines. But it's fundamental to who we are as a nation. And once you start creating categories of protests that can be banned based on their cumulative impact on community feelings, where exactly does that end? Climate protests that make oil workers feel targeted? Anti-Brexit demonstrations that make Leave voters feel attacked? Trade union strikes that make commuters feel intimidated? The slope isn't just slippery, it's practically vertical. The government will argue, and is arguing, that they are protecting the right to protest whilst ensuring public safety. But that's precisely the framing every government uses when it restricts civil liberties. It's always about balance. It's always about safety. It's always temporary, until it isn't. And it's always justified by the crisis of the moment. Today it's pro-Palestine protests in the wake of a synagogue attack. Tomorrow it could be environmental protests in the wake of some undefined threat to national infrastructure. Next year it could be protests against the government itself, deemed too intimidating to the political class. Robert Jenrick's comments are particularly telling. His call for extremism and antisemitism to be rooted out ruthlessly wherever it rears its head. Fine, no one's defending antisemitism. But notice the language, ruthlessly. No half measures. No tolerance. And when that mentality meets sweeping new police powers to ban protests based on feelings, you've got a combustible mixture that threatens far more than just pro-Palestine demonstrations. Here's what should concern everyone, regardless of where you stand on Palestine, Israel, or any other political issue. We're watching the normalization of protest suppression as a first resort rather than a last resort. The Home Secretary didn't say these powers will be used sparingly in extreme circumstances, with maximum restraint. She said there's a gap in the law that needs fixing. She said the arrangements we have can't meet the scale of the challenge we face. That's not the language of reluctant necessity. That's the language of someone who thinks protests have gotten out of hand and need to be brought to heel. The British establishment has always had an ambivalent relationship with protest. Tolerated when convenient, suppressed when threatening. But this feels different. This feels like a line being crossed. Because once you give police the power to ban protests based on cumulative impact and community feelings, you fundamentally altered the social contract. You said that the state's desire for order trumps the citizens' right to dissent. And that's not the Britain most of us thought we lived in. So where does this leave us? Well, the legislation hasn't been finalized yet. There will be debate, presumably, though given the current political climate, don't expect much resistance from either major party. Both Labour and the Conservatives seem perfectly content to expand state power when it comes to controlling public dissent. The details will matter enormously. How will cumulative impact be measured? Who decides which communities' feelings of intimidation are legally actionable? What appeals process will exist? These aren't minor technical questions. They are fundamental to whether we're talking about sensible restrictions or authoritarian overreach. But the broader point stands. We're watching British civil liberties being eroded in real time, and it's happening with remarkably little public outcry. Perhaps that's because the protests being targeted are politically controversial. Perhaps it's because people genuinely do feel intimidated. Or perhaps it's because we've collectively forgotten that rights only mean something when they protect speech and assembly we find uncomfortable. The easy cases don't need protection. It's the hard cases, the controversial protests, the demonstrations that make us squirm, that test whether we actually believe in freedom or just the appearance of it. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a much larger debate about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a nation that tolerates dissent, even when it's uncomfortable, even when communities feel intimidated, even when it challenges our most deeply held beliefs? Or do we want to be a nation where the state has the power to shut down protests it deems too disruptive, too repeated, too intimidating? Because we can't be both. And the choice we make now will define British democracy for a generation. If you found this analysis valuable, if it made you think, if it made you angry, or if it simply made you aware of something you didn't know was happening, then subscribe to UK Connors. Because this is a kind of story that matters, and we'll be following it closely. The fight for civil liberties doesn't end with one video. It's ongoing, it's urgent, and it needs all of us paying attention. See you in the next.